Lila Hart had exactly 3 minutes to decide if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. The stagecoach that brought her to Texas was already disappearing into the storm, swallowed by sheets of rain so thick she could barely see her own trembling hands. 23 years old, alone at a crossroads called Willow Creek, clutching 6 letters from a man she'd never met. A rancher who'd promised her a home, a future, something better than the suffocating parlors of Philadelphia. But Caleb Wren wasn't here. The road was empty, the sky was falling, and she was drowning in mud, wondering if hope was just another word for foolish. If you're watching from somewhere beyond the storm tonight, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Lila's story travels. And if you believe in second chances and the courage it takes to claim them, hit that like button and stay with us until the very end, because what happens next will change everything. The rain came down like punishment. Lila stood at the edge of the crossroads, her traveling dress already soaked through to her chemise, the fabric clinging to her skin in cold, unforgiving folds. April in Texas, she'd been told, meant wildflowers and gentle breezes. No one had mentioned floods. No one had mentioned standing alone in the middle of nowhere while thunder cracked the sky open and the earth turned to soup beneath her boots. The stagecoach driver hadn't even looked sorry. Willow Creek, he'd announced, as if the 3 weather-beaten buildings huddled against the storm constituted a town. "Your stop, miss." He'd handed down her traveling bag with the efficiency of a man who'd done this 100 times, who knew that mail-order brides were just another kind of cargo, and then he'd snapped the reins and left her there, alone, wet, and beginning to understand what irreversible truly meant. She pressed her bag against her chest, feeling the hard edges of her belongings through the leather. One spare dress, carefully folded. A cameo brooch that had belonged to her mother. A small book of poetry she'd read so many times the spine had gone soft. And the letters, 6 of them, tied with string, each one a piece of the conversation that had carried her across 1,000 miles to this exact moment of doubt. "Dear Miss Hart," the first one had begun, "I am not a man of eloquent words, but I am a man of honest intention." She'd read that line dozens of times in her narrow room in Philadelphia, in the house where her aunt's voice cut through walls like a blade, reminding Lila daily that she was 23 and unmarried, educated and unemployed, a burden with opinions and no prospects. The letters from Caleb Wren had arrived like oxygen, but Caleb Wren wasn't here. The rain intensified, hammering down so hard it stung her face. Lila turned in a slow circle, searching for shelter, for a sign, for anything that suggested she hadn't just ruined her entire life on the word of a stranger. One of the buildings, barely more than a shack, had a covered porch. She made for it, her boots sucking at the mud with every step, her skirts dragging 10 pounds of Texas clay. She reached the porch just as lightning split the sky, illuminating the landscape in a flash of silver white. For one brief second, she saw it all. The endless stretch of rolling hills, the dark smudge of mesquite trees bending in the wind, the road cutting through it like a scar, leading away to places she'd never seen, places she'd probably never reach if Caleb Wren had changed his mind. The thought hit her like a fist to the stomach. What if he'd changed his mind? What if he'd taken one look at her photograph, the one she'd sent 3 months ago, the one where she'd tried to look pleasant and hopeful instead of desperate, and decided she wasn't worth the trouble? What if the letters had been some kind of game, some lonely rancher's entertainment, and she was the punchline standing in the rain? Lila sank onto a wooden bench, her bag in her lap, and pressed her palms against her eyes. She wouldn't cry. She'd promised herself, when she'd bought the train ticket, when she'd endured her aunt's screaming condemnation, when she'd written her final letter to Caleb saying, "Yes, I'm coming, I'll be there April 18th, she'd promised herself she wouldn't cry. But the rain was so loud, and she was so cold, and Philadelphia felt like another lifetime. She'd been a school teacher there, though the position had lasted less than a year. The headmaster had made it clear that her modern ideas about education, the radical notion that girls might benefit from mathematics and science as much as needlework, were not welcome. Her aunt had been mortified. "You embarrass yourself, Lila. You embarrass this family. No man wants a wife who thinks she's smarter than him." Maybe that was true. Maybe that was why, at 23, she'd never received a single serious offer of courtship. The men in Philadelphia had looked at her like she was a puzzle with missing pieces, smart enough to be interesting, stubborn enough to be difficult, poor enough to be ignored. So when she'd seen the advertisement in the Philadelphia Inquirer, rancher in Texas seeks correspondence with educated woman of good character for potential matrimony, she'd written before she could talk herself out of it. And Caleb Wren had written back. Dear Miss Hart, I received your letter with genuine interest. You ask what kind of man places an advertisement for a wife, and that is a fair question. I am the kind of man who has learned that proximity does not guarantee compatibility, and loneliness is not improved by poor matches made in haste. I am 30 years old, owner of a cattle ranch near Willow Creek, Texas. I live simply, work hard, and I'm looking for a partner who understands that a good life is built, not handed over. If you're willing to continue this conversation, I would be grateful to know more about you. Respectfully, Caleb Wren. She'd read that letter so many times she'd memorized the rhythm of his sentences, the places where his pen had paused. He didn't write like a man trying to charm her. He wrote like a man trying to be understood. And over the next 3 months, through 6 careful letters, she'd come to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a place in the world where being smart and stubborn wasn't a liability. But now, sitting alone in the storm, those letters felt dangerously thin. A crack of thunder shook the porch, and Lila flinched. She needed to think. She needed a plan. The stagecoach wouldn't return for a week. The driver had made that clear. There was no hotel, no boarding house, nothing that resembled civilization beyond the 3 sad structures shivering in the rain. She had $47 sewn into the lining of her bag, enough to survive for a while if she was careful, but survive where? Doing what? Go back, her aunt's voice whispered in her mind. Admit you were wrong. Beg forgiveness. Lila's hands curled into fists. She would rather drown in this mud than go back. The rain eased slightly, shifting from a roar to a steady drum. Lila stood, shaking out her skirts, a useless gesture, given that every inch of fabric was plastered to her legs, and scanned the area again. There had to be someone here. Someone who knew Caleb Wren. Someone who could tell her if she'd been abandoned or if he was simply delayed. One of the other buildings had a painted sign, barely legible through the rain. General Store. Lila picked up her bag and stepped back into the weather. The mud grabbed at her immediately, slick and greedy. She moved carefully, testing each step, her eyes on the store's dim outline. She was halfway there when her boot caught on something. A root, a rock, some hidden betrayal beneath the surface. And she went down hard, her bag flying from her hands. She hit the ground with a gasp, mud splashing up into her face, her mouth, her eyes. For a second, she just lay there, stunned and furious, tasting Texas. Then she scrambled to her knees, wiping at her face, searching frantically for her bag. It had landed several feet away, tipped on its side, its contents spilling into a puddle. No, 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 no! Lila lunged for it, but the mud was like quicksand, pulling at her skirts, her hands, everything. She managed to grab the bag, but the damage was done. Her spare dress was already soaked, a dark lump of fabric floating in muddy water. The poetry book was ruined, its pages swelling. And the letters were scattering. Lila's heart stopped. She grabbed for them, her fingers clumsy and desperate, but the rain was dissolving the ink, turning Caleb's careful words into blurred shadows. She clutched 3 of them against her chest, but the others were already washing away, illegible, gone. Something inside her cracked. She knelt there in the mud, holding the surviving letters, and the rain poured down, and she thought, this is it. This is the moment I'll remember when I'm old, the moment I lost everything that mattered. And then she heard hoofbeats. At first, she thought she'd imagined it. The rain-distorted sound made everything uncertain, but the rhythm grew louder, clearer, a horse moving fast, cutting through the storm with purpose. Lila looked up, her vision blurred by rain and mud, and saw him. A man on horseback, emerging from the downpour like something out of a fevered dream. Tall in the saddle, hat pulled low against the weather, moving toward her with the kind of certainty that suggested he'd been looking for something and just found it. He reined in a few feet away, and the horse, a big roan gelding, steady despite the storm, tossed its head, snorting steam into the cold air. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the mud with a wet slap, and when he looked at her, Lila felt the full weight of his attention, focused, assessing, unflinching. Lila Hart? His voice cut through the rain, rough-edged but not unkind. She couldn't speak. She could only stare, her mind racing to catch up. This was him. This had to be him. Caleb Wren. He'd come. Yes, she managed, her voice barely audible. I'm Lila. He didn't smile, but something in his expression shifted, a subtle relaxation that might have been relief. He moved closer, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in the mud, the soaked dress, the bag with its ruined contents, the letters clutched in her white-knuckled hands. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. He just looked at her, and Lila felt herself being seen in a way she wasn't sure she'd ever been seen before. Not judged, not pitied, just seen. Then Caleb Wren did something she didn't expect. He knelt in the mud beside her. "You're hurt?" he asked, his voice quieter now, concerned. "No, I fell. Lila's throat tightened. "My letters. I dropped them, and they're—" She gestured helplessly at the puddle, at the blurred ink, at the mess of everything. Caleb glanced at the water, then back at her face. "The letters you wrote, or the ones I sent?" "Yours," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. Don't." The word was firm but not harsh. He reached into the puddle, carefully retrieving a piece of soaked paper, and held it up to the dim light. The ink had run, the words nearly gone, but he studied it anyway, his jaw tight. Then he looked at her again, and his expression was unreadable. "You kept them." It wasn't a question, but Lila nodded anyway. "Everyone." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, maybe, or something deeper. He set the ruined letter aside and reached for her cameo brooch, half submerged in the mud. He wiped it clean on his sleeve, examined it briefly, then handed it to her. "This belonged to someone," he said. "My mother." Lila took it with trembling hands, cradling it like it might shatter. "She died when I was 12. Caleb nodded slowly, as if this explained something important. Then he stood, scanning the area for anything else worth saving. The poetry book was beyond repair. The dress was salvageable, maybe, if she didn't mind it dyed brown. He gathered everything carefully, methodically, and placed it all back in her bag with a gentleness that made Lila's chest ache. When he finished, he straightened and looked down at her, still kneeling in the mud. "Can you stand?" Lila tried. Her legs were shaking, from cold, from exhaustion, from the overwhelming strangeness of this moment, but she managed to get to her feet, swaying slightly. Caleb's hand shot out, steadying her by the elbow, his grip firm and warm, even through her wet sleeve. "The stagecoach left you here," he said. It wasn't quite a question, but there was anger beneath the words, a tightly controlled fury that had nothing to do with her. "He said this was Willow Creek." "It is, sort of." Caleb's mouth pressed into a hard line. "The actual town is 5 miles south. This is just—" He gestured at the 3 miserable buildings. "A stop. I told you to wait in town. In my last letter, I said—" "I didn't get a last letter." Lila's voice came out sharper than she intended. "The last one I received was from 6 weeks ago." Caleb went very still. 6 weeks. "Yes." He swore under his breath, a single vicious word that got lost in the rain. "The mail out here is—" He stopped himself, shook his head. "Doesn't matter now. You're here. You're freezing. We need to get you dry." He turned toward his horse, and Lila felt a sudden spike of panic. "Wait, where are we going?" Caleb paused, looking back at her with an expression that might have been confusion. "My ranch. Where else?" "I don't—" Lila swallowed hard, hating how small her voice sounded. "I don't know you." The words hung between them, stark and honest. Caleb studied her for a long moment, and Lila braced herself for anger, for impatience, for all the ways a man might respond to a woman questioning his intentions. But instead, he nodded. "You're right," he said quietly. "You don't." He took a slow breath, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "But it's 20 miles back to the nearest real town, and you're soaked through. This storm's not letting up anytime soon, and there's nowhere safe for you to stay out here. My ranch is 6 miles northwest, I've got a spare bedroom, a fire, and food. I also have a ranch hand, Wade Carver, who'll vouch that I'm not a danger to you." He paused. "I know you're taking all this on faith. I know it's not fair, but it's the best option you've got right now." Lila's mind raced. Everything he said was true. She was freezing, exhausted, and stranded. The alternative was, what? Staying here, in the mud, waiting for a stagecoach that wouldn't return for a week? Trusting that one of these ramshackle buildings might shelter her without demanding something she wasn't willing to give? She looked at Caleb. Really looked at him. He was older than she'd imagined, though not by much. Early 30s, maybe. Tall and lean, with the kind of build that came from hard physical labor, not leisure. His face was weathered, lined at the corners of his eyes in a way that suggested he spent most of his time squinting into the sun. His hands were scarred, calloused, capable. He looked like a man who kept his word because breaking it would be inconceivable. But she'd been wrong about people before. "If I come with you," Lila said slowly, "and I decide I want to leave, will you take me back to town? No questions? No arguments?" Caleb didn't hesitate. "Yes." "You swear it?" "I swear it." Lila searched his face for any sign of deception, any hint that this was a trap. She found nothing but patience and something that looked almost like understanding. "All right," she said finally. "Let's go." Caleb brought the horse closer, and Lila realized with a sinking feeling that she was expected to ride it. She'd been on a horse exactly twice in her life, both times on a docile mare at a county fair, led in slow circles by a patient attendant. This animal was enormous, and it was eyeing her with what seemed like deep skepticism. I don't really ride," she admitted. "That's fine. You won't have to." Caleb picked up her bag and secured it behind the saddle with quick, efficient movements. Then he turned back to her. "I'm going to put you up there, and I'll walk alongside. The ground's too slick to risk both of us in the saddle." Lila blinked. "You're going to walk? In this?" "I've walked through worse." "But, Miss Hart." He met her eyes, and his expression was calm, immovable. "I've been riding in storms since I was 10 years old. You've been standing in one for maybe half an hour, and you're already shaking. This isn't a debate." Before she could argue, he'd stepped close enough that she could smell leather and rain and something earthy, like cedar, and placed his hands on her waist. "May I?" The question caught her off guard. Permission. He was asking permission. Lila nodded, too startled to speak, and then Caleb lifted her, effortlessly, as if she weighed nothing, and set her in the saddle. The world tilted. Lila grabbed for the saddle horn, her heart hammering, and the horse shifted beneath her, a living, breathing thing that she had absolutely no idea how to control. "Easy," Caleb said, and it took Lila a second to realize he was talking to her, not the horse. He adjusted her feet in the stirrups, his hands impersonal, businesslike. "Hold on to the horn, don't pull the reins, he'll follow me, just stay balanced." "What's his name?" Lila asked, desperate for something to focus on besides the fact that she was 6 feet off the ground on an animal that could bolt at any second. "Copper." Caleb gathered the reins, his hand resting briefly on the horse's neck. "He's steady. He won't spook." "How do you know?" "Because I trained him." Caleb glanced up at her, and for the first time there was something almost like a smile at the corner of his mouth, barely there, but real. "And because if he throws you, I'll shoot him." Lila's eyes went wide. "You wouldn't—" "No," Caleb agreed. "But he doesn't know that." And then he started walking, leading Copper into the rain, and Lila had no choice but to hold on and trust that this stranger, this man she'd traveled 1,000 miles to marry, wasn't leading her toward a mistake she'd regret for the rest of her life. They moved northwest, away from the crossroads, into open country that seemed to stretch forever in every direction. The rain had settled into a steady, relentless rhythm, and the landscape blurred into shades of gray and green, punctuated by the dark silhouettes of mesquite and the occasional twisted oak. Caleb walked ahead, his stride long and even, never once looking back to check if she was still there. Lila found that oddly comforting. He wasn't performing reassurance, he was just moving forward, trusting her to keep up, and somehow that felt more respectful than if he'd hovered, She studied him as they traveled, trying to reconcile the man in front of her with the voice in the letters. He was quieter in person, more guarded. The letters had felt open, almost vulnerable at times. "I'm tired of being alone, Miss Hart, but I am more tired of pretending that loneliness can be cured by just anyone." Now, watching him move through the storm like it was nothing, she wondered if those words had cost him something to write. "How far?" she called out, her voice nearly lost in the rain. 4 miles, give or take." 4 miles. Lila's legs were already aching from gripping the saddle, and her hands were numb around the horn. She tried to shift her weight, but the saddle was slick, and she felt herself start to slide. Caleb stopped immediately, turning back. "You all right?" "Fine," Lila lied. He didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. Instead, he adjusted his pace, slowing slightly, and Lila realized he'd been watching her in his peripheral vision the whole time, attuned to every shift in her balance. They crossed a shallow creek, swollen from the rain but still passable, and Caleb guided Copper through the water with the kind of easy confidence that came from knowing every inch of this land. On the far side, the ground sloped upward, and Lila caught her first glimpse of something other than emptiness. A fence line, weathered but intact, stretching into the distance. "That's mine," Caleb said, following her gaze. "The property starts here." Lila looked at the fence, then at the hills beyond, trying to imagine what it meant to own something this vast. In Philadelphia, property was measured in narrow lots, cramped row houses pressed shoulder to shoulder. Here, the land seemed to have no edges, no boundaries except the ones a man carved out for himself. "How much?" She paused, unsure if the question was rude. "How big is it?" 800 acres. Caleb didn't sound boastful, just factual. "Most of it's grazing land. I run about 200 head of cattle, some horses. It's not the biggest operation, but it's mine." Mine. The way he said it, quiet, possessive, proud, made Lila's chest tighten. She'd never owned anything in her life except the contents of her traveling bag. Everything else had belonged to her aunt or the school or the church. The idea of having something that was undeniably, irrevocably hers felt almost impossible. "You built this yourself?" she asked. "Most of it. My father started the ranch 20 years ago, but he died when I was 17. I've been running it since." "Alone?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, and Lila wondered if she'd touched something painful. Then he said, "Wade's been with me for 5 years. Good man, works hard. Beyond that, yeah, alone." The words settled between them, heavy and honest. They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds the steady drum of rain and Copper's hooves sucking at the mud. Lila's thoughts drifted back to the letters, to the line that had convinced her to come here. "I want a partner, Miss Hart. Not a housekeeper, not decoration. A partner. Someone who can stand beside me and build something that lasts." She'd read that sentence 100 times, testing it for sincerity, trying to decide if it was real or just pretty words designed to lure in desperate women. Now, watching Caleb lead her through a storm without complaint, without expectation, she thought maybe, just maybe, he'd meant it. The rain began to ease as they crested a low hill, and suddenly the ranch came into view. It wasn't what Lila had expected. She'd imagined something rough, barely more than a shelter, maybe a cabin with a leaking roof and dirt floors. Instead, she saw a solid house, 2 stories, built from weathered wood and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Nearby stood a barn, large and well-maintained, and beyond that a series of smaller outbuildings and corrals. Smoke rose from the chimney, a thin gray line against the storm, and warm light glowed in one of the downstairs windows. It looked like a home. Caleb stopped at the edge of the yard, and for the first time since they'd left the crossroads, he looked back at her. "This is it." Lila stared at the house, her throat tight. It's beautiful." He blinked, surprised. "It's functional. It's both." Caleb studied her for a moment as if trying to decide whether she was being polite or honest, and then he turned and led Copper toward the barn. They passed through the wide double doors into a space that smelled of hay and leather and animal warmth, blessedly dry and out of the wind. A man emerged from one of the stalls, shorter than Caleb, stockier, with a weathered face and sharp, curious eyes. He took one look at Lila, rain-soaked and shivering on Copper's back, and let out a low whistle. "Well, hell, Caleb, you found her. Wade, this is Miss Hart. Miss Hart, Wade Carver." Wade grinned, tipping his hat. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am. Caleb's been pacing holes in the floor all afternoon, worrying you wouldn't show." Wade, "What?" "It's true." Wade's grin widened. "Man rode out into that storm like the devil himself was chasing him. I told him you'd be fine, but he wouldn't listen." Caleb ignored him, reaching up to help Lila down from the saddle. His hands were steady on her waist, lowering her carefully until her feet touched solid ground. Her legs nearly buckled, half from exhaustion, half from the relief of being still, and Caleb's grip tightened, holding her upright. "You all right?" Lila nodded, not trusting her voice. She was cold, wet, and more tired than she'd ever been in her life. But she was here. She'd made it. Caleb released her slowly, making sure she was steady, then turned to Wade. "Get Copper dried off and fed. I'll take Miss Hart inside." "You got it, boss." Wade moved to take the horse's reins, but not before shooting Lila another smile. "Welcome to the Wren Ranch, Miss Hart. You're braver than most, I'll give you that." Before Lila could ask what he meant, Caleb had picked up her bag and was already heading toward the barn doors. She hurried after him, back into the rain, across the muddy yard and up onto the porch. The moment she stepped under the roof, the sound of the rain changed, muffled now, distant. Caleb opened the front door and gestured her inside, and Lila crossed the threshold into warmth. The interior was simple but clean. Wood floors, sturdy furniture, a stone fireplace with a fire crackling cheerfully. The main room served as both kitchen and living space, with a table near the window, a few chairs, shelves lined with books and practical supplies. A narrow staircase led to the second floor. It smelled like coffee and wood smoke and something baking, bread maybe. It smelled like someone actually lived here, not just survived. Caleb set her bag down near the door and moved to the fireplace, adding another log. "You should get out of those wet clothes before you catch pneumonia. The bedroom's upstairs, first door on the left. There's a clean quilt on the bed, and I'll bring up some hot water in a few minutes so you can wash." Lila blinked. "Upstairs?" "Yes." Where do you sleep?" Caleb straightened, brushing ash from his hands, and met her eyes. "I've been sleeping in the barn since I knew you were coming. Didn't seem right to make you uncomfortable." The statement landed with quiet, devastating honesty. He'd been sleeping in the barn. For her. So she'd feel safe. "You didn't have to do that," Lila said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know." Caleb's expression didn't change. "But I did." For a long moment, they just looked at each other, and Lila felt something shift, some wall inside her that had been braced for disappointment beginning to crack. "Thank you," she said finally. Caleb nodded. "Go get warm. We'll talk after." Lila picked up her bag and climbed the stairs, her legs heavy, her mind spinning. The bedroom was exactly as he'd described, simple, clean, with a bed covered in a thick quilt that looked handmade. A window overlooked the yard, and even through the rain she could see the dark outline of the barn. She peeled off her wet clothes, her fingers clumsy with cold, and wrapped herself in the quilt. It was warm, soft, and smelled faintly of cedar. She sank onto the edge of the bed and closed her eyes, letting the exhaustion wash over her. She'd made it. Against every doubt, every fear, every voice in her head that had screamed she was making a mistake. She'd made it. And downstairs, a man she barely knew was heating water for her, keeping a fire burning, offering her shelter without asking for anything in return. Lila opened her eyes and looked around the room, her room, at least for tonight, and thought for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach that maybe hope wasn't foolish after all. Maybe it was just the beginning. Lila woke to silence. For a moment she didn't remember where she was. The bed was unfamiliar, the quilt too warm, the air carrying scents she didn't recognize, wood smoke and coffee, and something clean, like sun-dried linen. Then it came back in a rush. The storm, the mud, Caleb Wren kneeling beside her in the rain, saving her letters like they mattered. She sat up slowly, her body aching in places she didn't know could ache. Gray light filtered through the window, soft and diffuse, suggesting early morning. The rain had stopped. She could hear birds, actual birds, Not the city sparrows of Philadelphia, but something wilder, their calls echoing across open space. Lila pushed back the quilt and stood, wrapping her arms around herself against the cool air. Her traveling dress hung over a chair where she'd left it last night, still damp, but no longer dripping. Someone, Caleb presumably, had left a basin of clean water on the washstand, along with a folded towel and a small bar of soap that smelled faintly of lye and herbs. She washed quickly, scrubbing away the last remnants of yesterday's mud, then dressed in her spare outfit, a simple brown skirt and white shirtwaist that had somehow survived the journey mostly intact. Her hair was a disaster, tangled and matted, but she managed to work through the worst of it with her fingers and twist it into a loose bun at the nape of her neck. When she finally made her way downstairs, the house was empty. The fire had been banked to coals, but the room was still warm. On the table sat a covered plate, biscuits, she discovered when she lifted the cloth, still faintly warm, and a pot of coffee on the stove, steam curling from the spout. A note rested beside the plate, written in the same careful handwriting she recognized from the letters. Miss Hart, didn't want to wake you. There's breakfast here and more in the pantry if you're still hungry. Wade and I are checking the south fence line. Storm damage. Should be back by midday. Make yourself at home. C.W. Lila read the note 3 times, her finger tracing the initials at the bottom. Make yourself at home. As if it were that simple. As if she could just settle into this house, this life, like slipping into a familiar coat. She poured herself coffee, strong and bitter, the way frontier coffee seemed to be, and took a biscuit to the window. Outside, the world had transformed overnight. The storm had washed everything clean, leaving the hills vivid green under a sky that was slowly clearing, patches of blue breaking through the gray. She could see the fence line Caleb had mentioned yesterday, stretching toward the horizon, and beyond it, cattle grazing in clusters, their dark shapes moving slowly across the grass. It was beautiful, terrifyingly, impossibly beautiful, and she had no idea what she was supposed to do with herself. In Philadelphia, her days had been rigidly structured, teaching when she had a position, helping her aunt with household tasks when she didn't, always under the weight of expectation and judgment. Here, there was nothing but space and silence and the distant sound of cattle lowing. Lila finished her coffee, washed the cup in the basin by the stove, and then stood in the middle of the room feeling utterly lost. Her gaze landed on the pantry door, slightly ajar. She crossed to it, pulling it open, and found shelves stocked with basic supplies: flour, sugar, cornmeal, dried beans, a few tins of preserved goods. Everything was organized with the kind of efficiency that spoke of someone who'd been managing alone for a long time. She could make more biscuits. Or bread. Something useful. Something that proved she wasn't just a burden who'd arrived in the middle of a storm and collapsed into the nearest bed. Lila rolled up her sleeves and got to work. By the time she heard voices outside, she'd managed to produce a loaf of bread, slightly lopsided but edible, and a pot of beans that had been soaking and were now simmering on the stove. The kitchen smelled like yeast and wood smoke, and Lila's hands were dusted with flour, her face warm from the heat of the oven. The door opened and Caleb stepped inside, followed by Wade. Both men were mud-splattered and tired-looking, but they stopped short when they saw her, surprise flickering across their faces. "Miss Hart," Caleb said, his voice carefully neutral. "You didn't have to. I wanted to." Lila wiped her hands on a towel, suddenly self-conscious. "I hope that's all right. I didn't know what else to do with myself." Wade let out a low whistle, moving toward the stove. "Is that bread I smell?" "Yes, it's still cooling, but—" "Ma'am, you just became my favorite person in Texas." Wade grinned at her, then glanced at Caleb. "You didn't tell me she could cook." "I didn't know," Caleb said quietly, his eyes on Lila. There was something in his expression she couldn't quite read. Not disapproval, but not simple gratitude either. Something more complicated. "It's just bread," Lila said, feeling the need to deflate the moment. "Anyone can make bread." "Not anyone, Cho," Wade countered. "Caleb tried once. Nearly burned down the kitchen." "That was your fault," Caleb said, his tone dry. "You distracted me." "I asked you a question. That's not a distraction. That's conversation." Lila found herself smiling despite her nervousness. There was an easy rhythm between these two men, a kind of worn-in friendship that spoke of years together. It made the house feel less lonely, less like a stranger's territory. Caleb moved to the basin to wash his hands, his movements methodical. "The south fence took some damage," he said, addressing Lila over his shoulder. "A few posts down, some wire tangled. We'll need to ride back out this afternoon to finish repairs." "How bad is it?" Lila asked, though she had no real context for what constituted bad fence damage. "Could be worse. Could be better." Caleb dried his hands and turned to face her. "The storm hit hard, but the herd's intact. That's what matters." Wade was already cutting into the bread, steam rising as he pulled the loaf apart. He took a bite and closed his eyes. "Caleb, you better marry this woman before someone else does." The words landed like a stone in still water. Lila felt her face heat, and Caleb went very still. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Caleb said, his voice quiet and firm, "Wade, outside." Wade's grin faltered. "I was just outside." Wade set down the bread, shot Lila an apologetic look, and slipped out the door. Caleb waited until it closed behind him, then turned to Lila with an expression that might have been embarrassment or frustration or both. "I apologize for that," he said. "Wade doesn't think before he speaks sometimes." "It's all right." Lila's hands twisted in the towel. "He didn't mean any harm." "No, but—" Caleb stopped, seeming to struggle for words. "I don't want you to feel pressured. That's not why I brought you here." "I know." And she did. Whatever else she wasn't sure about, she believed that much. "Can I ask you something?" Caleb nodded, his posture tense, braced for difficulty. "What happens now?" Lila asked. "I mean, I came here because we talked about marriage, because you wrote that you wanted a partner, but we don't know each other. Not really. So what happens now?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady on hers. Then he crossed to the table and pulled out a chair, gesturing for her to sit. Lila did, and he sat across from her, his hands folded on the scarred wood. "I've been thinking about that," he said finally. "All night, actually. And here's what I think. You came a long way based on letters and faith. That took courage. But you're right. We don't know each other. Not the way people should before they make permanent decisions." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "So, here's what I'm proposing. You stay. For a while. A month, maybe 2. Get to know the ranch, get to know me. Figure out if this is a life you actually want. If it is, we move forward. If it's not, if you decide this was a mistake, I'll take you back to town, give you enough money to get wherever you want to go, and we call it done. No hard feelings, no obligations." Lila stared at him, her heart pounding. "You'd do that? Let me leave with no strings attached? I told you last night I would. I meant it. But what about you? What if I stay 2 months and then leave? You'll be right back where you started." Caleb's mouth quirked, almost a smile. "Miss Hart, I've been alone for a long time. 2 more months won't kill me. And I'd rather spend that time finding out the truth than rushing into something that makes us both miserable." It was such a reasonable offer, such a fair offer, and yet Lila felt a strange twinge of something that might have been disappointment. Part of her, a small, irrational part, had wanted him to say he was certain that he'd known from her letters she was the one, that there was no question in his mind. But that was a fairy tale, and Lila had never believed in fairy tales. "All right," she said, 2 months, and we see what happens." Caleb extended his hand across the table, formal and deliberate. "Deal?" Lila looked at his hand, scarred, calloused, steady, and placed hers in it. His grip was warm, firm, and when he shook her hand once, she felt the weight of the promise behind it. "Deal." The rest of the day passed in a strange blur of normalcy. Wade returned, sheepish and apologetic, and the 3 of them ate lunch together at the table. Lila's bread with butter and honey, beans, leftover biscuits. The conversation stayed light, Wade filling the silence with stories about the ranch, about mishaps with cattle and close calls with rattlesnakes, painting a picture of a life that was hard, but not unhappy. Lila listened, absorbing details, trying to imagine herself as part of this world. Caleb didn't talk much, but he watched her, not in a way that felt intrusive, but with a kind of quiet attention that suggested he was trying to figure her out the same way she was trying to figure him out. After lunch, the men returned to the south fence, and Lila was left alone again. She cleaned the kitchen, explored the pantry more thoroughly, and then, feeling bold, ventured outside. The air was cool and clean, washed by the storm. Lila walked slowly around the yard, taking in the barn, the chicken coop she hadn't noticed before, the small vegetable garden plot that looked like it had been neglected. Everything was functional, practical, built to last. She made her way to the barn, curiosity overcoming caution. Inside, the space was dim and warm, smelling of hay and horses. Copper stood in one of the stalls, his ears flicking toward her as she approached. "Hello?" Lila said softly, stopping a few feet away. "Remember me? I'm the one who doesn't know how to ride." Copper snorted, unimpressed. Lila smiled despite herself and moved closer, cautiously extending her hand. The horse regarded her with large, intelligent eyes, then lowered his head and allowed her to touch his nose. His coat was soft, warm, and something about the simple act of touching him made her feel less adrift. "You're a good boy, aren't you?" she murmured. "You didn't throw me yesterday, even though you could have." "He likes you." Lila spun around to find Caleb standing in the barn doorway, his silhouette backlit by afternoon sun. She hadn't heard him approach. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not intruding. This is—" He paused, then corrected himself. "You're welcome anywhere on the property." He moved into the barn, his boots quiet on the packed earth, and joined her by Copper's stall. The horse immediately pushed his head against Caleb's shoulder, and Caleb scratched behind his ears with the ease of long familiarity. "Wade went into town for supplies," Caleb said. "Won't be back until tomorrow. I wanted to let you know in case you—" He stopped, seeming to search for the right words. "In case it makes you uncomfortable, being here alone with me." Lila considered this. Yesterday, the thought would have terrified her. Today, standing in the barn with sunlight slanting through the gaps in the wood and Caleb's steady presence beside her, it felt less frightening. "I'll be fine," she said. Caleb nodded, accepting this, but he didn't move to leave. Instead, he said, "Can I show you something?" "Of course." He led her out of the barn, across the yard, and up a slight rise behind the house. At the top, he stopped, and Lila caught her breath. The view was staggering. The ranch spread out below them, the house, the barn, the pastures rolling away toward the hills, and beyond that, the land stretched to the horizon in waves of green and gold, endless and overwhelming and impossibly beautiful. "This is why I stayed," Caleb said quietly. "After my father died. I could have sold the ranch, moved to a city, started over, but I stood up here one morning and thought, how could I leave this?" Lila understood. She'd felt the same way looking out the window this morning, the same pull toward something she couldn't quite name. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Staying?" Caleb was silent for a moment, his eyes on the horizon. "Sometimes, when the work's hard, or the winters are brutal, or I go weeks without talking to anyone but Wade and the cattle. But then I come up here, and I remember why it matters. This land, it's not easy, but it's honest. It doesn't lie to you. It doesn't pretend to be something it's not." He turned to look at her, and his expression was open in a way it hadn't been before. "I wrote in one of my letters that I wanted a partner, someone who could build something with me. I meant it. But I also need you to understand what you'd be signing up for. This life, it's not Philadelphia. It's not parties and society and easy answers. It's work. It's isolation. It's going days without seeing another soul except the person you're standing next to." He paused. "I need to know if you can live with that." Lila's throat tightened. The question was fair. It was necessary, and it terrified her. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I want to say yes. I want to believe I'm strong enough, brave enough, but I've never done anything like this. I've never been tested this way." "That's fair," Caleb said. "But you came here, didn't you? Despite everything. That counts for something." They stood together on the rise as the sun began to sink toward the hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Lila thought about Philadelphia, about her aunt's cutting words and the suffocating parlors and the endless grinding certainty that she would never fit into the life that was expected of her. And then she thought about this space, this silence, this impossible beauty, and the man standing beside her who'd offered her 2 months to decide if she wanted to stay. "Can I ask you something?" Lila said. "Anything." "Why me?" The question came out smaller than she'd intended. "You could have chosen anyone. Why did you answer my letter?" Caleb looked at her, and something shifted in his eyes, surprise maybe that she'd even asked. "Because you were honest," he said simply. "You didn't try to impress me or pretend to be something you weren't. You told me about losing your teaching position, about your aunt, about feeling like you didn't fit anywhere. And I thought, here's someone who understands what it's like to be looking for a place that feels like home." He paused. "I'm looking for the same thing, Miss Hart. I've got the land. I've got the house. But it doesn't feel like home when you're the only one in it." The words settled between them, quiet and profound. "Lila," she said softly. Caleb blinked. "What?" "My name. You keep calling me Miss Hart and CHৰীষ্টH, and it feels formal. If we're going to spend 2 months figuring this out, you should probably call me Lila." A slow smile spread across Caleb's face, the first real smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed his entire expression. "All right, Lila." He tested the name, his voice careful around it, like something precious. "And you can call me Caleb." "I know." Lila found herself smiling back. "I read your letters, remember?" "Right." Caleb's smile lingered, and for a moment they just stood there, two strangers on a hilltop, trying to figure out how to become something more. That night, Lila lay awake in the upstairs bedroom, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling around her. Somewhere outside, a coyote called, long and mournful, and she heard the distant lowing of cattle. The house creaked in the wind, and she thought about Caleb, wherever he was sleeping. The barn, probably. Cold and uncomfortable, because he'd given her the only real bed. The thought made her chest ache. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow she'd tell him he could sleep in his own house. They could figure out the logistics. Maybe she'd take the downstairs, or they'd work out some kind of schedule. But she wasn't going to be the reason he spent another night in the barn. Satisfied with this plan, Lila finally closed her eyes and drifted towards sleep, thinking about bread and coffee and the way Caleb had smiled when she'd asked him to use her name. She woke to the smell of smoke. For a confused second, she thought it was the fireplace, but the scent was too strong, too acrid. Lila bolted upright, her heart hammering, and saw flickering orange light dancing across the walls. Fire. She threw off the quilt and ran to the window. Outside, flames were licking up the side of the barn, spreading fast, feeding on dry wood and old hay. Lila didn't think. She grabbed her shawl, flew down the stairs, and burst out into the night. The heat hit her immediately, fierce and terrifying. The barn was fully engulfed on one side, flames climbing toward the roof, and she could hear the horses screaming, high, panicked shrieks that cut through the roar of the fire. "Caleb!" Lila shouted, her voice swallowed by the noise. "Caleb!" He appeared from somewhere in the chaos, his face streaked with soot, leading 2 horses out of the barn. Not Copper, she realized with a jolt of fear, but 2 others, smaller, wild-eyed with terror. He got them clear of the building and slapped their flanks, sending them bolting toward the open pasture. Then he turned back toward the barn. "No!" Lila ran toward him, grabbing his arm. "You can't go back in there." Copper's still inside. Caleb's voice was rough with smoke. "And the tack room's on the south side. If the fire reaches it, then let it burn." Lila tightened her grip, desperate. "It's not worth your life." "He saved your life yesterday." Caleb looked at her, his eyes fierce and determined. "I'm not leaving him." He pulled free from her grasp and ran back into the burning barn. Lila stood frozen, her heart in her throat, watching the flames climb higher. Seconds passed like hours. The roof groaned, a sound like the world breaking, and she thought, this is it. This is how it ends. I came all this way, and I'm going to watch him die in front of me. Then Caleb emerged, leading Copper, the horse's eyes rolling white with fear but following, trusting. Caleb got him 20 feet from the barn before the roof collapsed with a sound like thunder, sending sparks and embers exploding into the night sky. Lila ran to them. Caleb was bent over, coughing, his hands on his knees, and she dropped beside him, her hands on his shoulders. "Are you hurt?" "Caleb, look at me. Are you hurt?" He shook his head, still coughing, and when he finally straightened, his face was black with soot, his eyes red-rimmed, but he was alive. "The barn," he rasped. "It's gone." Lila looked back at the inferno. He was right. There was nothing to save. The entire structure was collapsing in on itself, flames consuming everything. "How did it start?" she asked. "Don't know." Caleb's voice was hoarse. "Could have been a coal from the stove. Could have been something else. Doesn't matter now." They stood together, watching the barn burn, and Lila felt the weight of what had just happened settle over her. The barn was gone. The tack, the equipment, the supplies, all of it, destroyed. And Caleb had nearly died trying to save a horse. When the flames finally began to die down, leaving only smoldering ruins and drifting ash, Caleb turned to her. "You should go back inside," he said quietly. "Get some sleep. Nothing more we can do tonight." "What about you?" "I'll stay out here. Make sure it doesn't spread." "Then I'm staying too." Caleb started to argue, then seemed to realize it would be pointless. Instead, he nodded, and they sat together on the porch steps, watching the embers glow against the darkness, waiting for morning. Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening from black to gray to pale gold, revealing the full extent of the devastation. The barn was nothing but charred timber and ash, smoke still rising in thin ribbons from the wreckage. The acrid smell hung heavy in the air, and Lila's throat burned with every breath. Caleb hadn't moved from the porch steps. He sat with his forearms resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the ruins, his expression unreadable. Lila had dozed fitfully beside him, jerking awake every time the wind shifted or a timber collapsed, but Caleb hadn't slept at all. She could tell by the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his hands remained clenched even in stillness. "Caleb?" she said softly, her voice rough from smoke and exhaustion. "You should rest." He didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, emptied of emotion. "That barn was built by my father. 20 years old, survived storms, drought, everything this land threw at it." He paused. "Gone in one night." Lila's chest tightened. She wanted to say something comforting, something that would ease the weight she could see pressing down on him, but every phrase that came to mind felt hollow. "It's just a building you can rebuild. At least you're alive." All true, but none of it touched the real loss, the history, the memories, the tangible connection to his father that had just burned to ash. So instead, she did the only thing she could think of. She stood, brushed the soot from her skirt, and said, "I'll make coffee." Caleb's head turned slightly, not quite looking at her. "You don't have to." "I know." Lila met his eyes, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. "But you're going to need it, and so am I." She went inside before he could argue, moving through the kitchen with purpose. The fire in the stove had gone cold during the night, so she rebuilt it, coaxing flames from kindling and dry wood, then set the coffee pot to boil. Her hands moved automatically, grateful for the familiar task, while her mind raced through everything that needed to happen next. The horses were scattered across the pasture, spooked and unsettled. Copper was out there somewhere with the others, and they'd need to be rounded up, checked for injuries. The cattle would need tending. Fire made animals unpredictable, and the smell of smoke could trigger a stampede if they weren't careful. And then there was Wade. He'd returned from town today expecting to find the ranch as he'd left it, and instead he'd find this. Lila poured 2 cups of coffee and carried them outside. Caleb was standing now, closer to the wreckage, staring at what remained of the tack room. She approached slowly, extending one of the cups. "Here." He took it without looking at her, his fingers wrapping around the tin like he needed something solid to hold on to. They stood side by side in silence, drinking bitter coffee and watching smoke curl into the morning sky. "I need to ride out and check the herd," Caleb said finally. "Make sure they didn't bolt during the night. Could be halfway to Mexico by now if they spooked hard enough." "I'll come with you." Caleb glanced at her, surprise flickering across his soot-streaked face. "You don't ride, remember?" "Then I'll learn." Lila's voice came out stronger than she felt. "You can't do this alone, and Wade's not here. So either you teach me, or you waste time arguing about it." For the first time since the fire, something almost like amusement touched Caleb's expression. "You always this stubborn? You're just figuring that out now?" The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "All right." But if you fall off, I'm not going back to Philadelphia to explain to your aunt why I got you killed." "Fair enough." They found Copper grazing near the fence line, remarkably calm considering the chaos of the previous night. The horse lifted his head as they approached, ears pricked forward, and walked toward Caleb without hesitation. Caleb ran his hands over Copper's legs and flanks, checking for burns or injuries, murmuring quiet reassurances the whole time. "He's fine," Caleb said, relief evident in his voice. "Scared, but fine." He looked at Lila. "You ready for your first real riding lesson?" Lila's stomach flipped, but she nodded. "Ready as I'll ever be." Caleb found a bridle in one of the outbuildings that had survived the fire and worked it onto Copper with practiced efficiency. Then he turned to Lila, his expression serious. "First rule: the horse can feel everything you're feeling. If you're nervous, he'll be nervous. If you're calm, he'll be calm. So breathe." Lila took a deep breath, then another, trying to quiet the hammering of her heart. "Good. Now, you're going to put your left foot in the stirrup, grab the saddle horn, and pull yourself up. I'll help, but you need to do most of the work. Copper needs to know you're capable." It took 3 tries and more inelegant scrambling than Lila wanted to admit, but she finally managed to haul herself into the saddle. The ground looked impossibly far away, and Copper shifted beneath her, adjusting to her weight. "Easy," Caleb said, his hand steady on her knee. "Just like yesterday. Hold the reins gently. You're guiding him, not fighting him. And keep your heels down or you'll slide right off when we start moving." "When we start moving?" Lila's voice pitched higher. "I thought we were just going to sit here for a while." "Can't check the herd from the yard." Caleb swung up behind her in one fluid motion, settling into the saddle with his chest against her back, his arms coming around her to take the reins. "Don't worry, I've got you." The words shouldn't have been as reassuring as they were, but Lila felt some of her tension ease. Caleb's presence was solid, steady, and when he clicked his tongue and Copper started walking, she focused on matching her breathing to the rhythm of the horse's gait. They rode east, toward the rising sun, crossing pasture land that rolled away in gentle swells. The morning was cool and clear, the storm's aftermath leaving everything sharp-edged and vivid. Lila found herself noticing details she'd missed before. The way wildflowers dotted the grass in small explosions of color, the tracks of deer cutting through soft earth, the distant silhouette of hills dark against the sky. "There," Caleb said, pointing toward a cluster of cattle grazing near a creek. "That's about half the herd. The rest will be scattered, but they'll come back on their own once they settle. Cattle are creatures of habit." "Like people," Lila said quietly. "Yeah, like people." Caleb's voice was close to her ear, his breath warm against her hair. "You doing all right?" "Better than I expected." And it was true. The initial terror had faded, replaced by something that felt almost like exhilaration. She was on horseback, riding across Texas rangeland with a man she barely knew, checking cattle after a barn fire, and somehow, impossibly, it felt right. They spent the next 2 hours riding the property, locating scattered groups of cattle, making sure none had injured themselves in panic. Caleb taught her as they went how to read the land, how to spot signs of trouble, how to tell if an animal was sick or just lazy. Lila absorbed it all, asking questions, committing everything to memory. When they finally turned back toward the ranch, the sun was high and hot, and Lila's legs were trembling from gripping the saddle. But she'd stayed on. She hadn't fallen, hadn't panicked, hadn't proven herself useless. As they crested the rise behind the house, Lila saw a horse and wagon in the yard. Wade was back. He was standing beside the remains of the barn, his hat in his hands, staring at the destruction with an expression of pure shock. When he heard Copper's hooves, he turned, and relief flooded his face. "Thank God," Wade said as Caleb dismounted and then helped Lila down. "I saw the smoke from 2 miles out and thought—" He stopped, seeming unable to finish the sentence. "What the hell happened?" "Fire started sometime after midnight," Caleb said, his voice matter of fact. "Don't know how. Got the horses out, but the barn's a total loss." Wade swore, long and creative. Then he looked at Lila, taking in her soot-stained clothes, her disheveled hair, the exhaustion written across her face. "You all right, Miss Hart?" "I'm fine," Lila said. "Just tired." She helped, Caleb said quietly. Kept watch with me all night. Rode out this morning to check the herd. Wade's eyebrows shot up. You got her on a horse? Didn't have much choice. But there was something almost like pride in Caleb's voice, and when Lila met his eyes, she saw it confirmed there, a kind of respect that hadn't been present before. Wade shook his head, then turned back to the ruins. Well, hell of a way to start a partnership. He looked at Caleb. What do you need? Inventory of what survived, Caleb said immediately, slipping into the kind of focused efficiency Lila was beginning to recognize as his way of coping with crisis. Check the other buildings, make sure there's no structural damage. We'll need to clear the debris before we can think about rebuilding, and I want to know exactly how much this is going to cost. I'll get started. Wade hesitated. Caleb, you know if you need anything, if you need help. I know. Caleb's voice softened slightly. Thanks. Wade nodded and headed toward the smaller outbuildings, leaving Caleb and Lila standing together in the yard. The weight of what had happened settled over them again, heavier now in the full light of day. I should clean up, Lila said, suddenly aware of how filthy she must look, and make something to eat. You both must be starving. Lila. Caleb's hand caught her arm, gentle but firm, stopping her before she could escape into the house. Thank you for last night, for staying. Where else would I have gone? Inside, to safety. Most people would have. Most people didn't promise to spend 2 months figuring out if they belonged here. Lila met his eyes, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. I meant what I said, Caleb. I'm not just a guest. If I'm going to be here, I'm going to help. Something shifted in Caleb's expression, surprise maybe, or the beginning of trust. He released her arm but didn't step back. I need you to understand something. He gestured at the ruined barn. This is what life here looks like sometimes. Things burn. Cattle die. Storms destroy months of work in a single afternoon. It's not Philadelphia. It's not safe, or predictable, or easy. I know. Lila's throat tightened, but she forced herself to continue. And I'm scared. I'm terrified, actually. But I didn't come here looking for easy, Caleb. I came here looking for honest. She paused, searching for the right words. My whole life, people have told me what I should be, what I should want, how I should live, and all of it felt like a lie. But this? She looked at the ranch, at the endless sky, at the man standing in front of her covered in soot and exhaustion. This feels real. Caleb stared at her for a long moment, and Lila wondered if she'd said too much, revealed too much, pushed too hard. Then he did something completely unexpected. He smiled. Not the careful, guarded expression she'd seen before, but a real smile. Tired, and a little broken, but genuine. You're going to do just fine here, Lila Hart. The words settled into her chest like a promise, and for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, Lila allowed herself to believe it might be true. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of work and smoke-stained exhaustion. They cleared the barn debris, salvaging what little could be saved, a few tools, some hardware, metal pieces that could be reused. Wade rode into town and returned with supplies for a temporary shelter, and together the three of them built a rough lean-to against the side of the remaining storage shed. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the horses out of the weather. Lila fell into the rhythm of ranch life faster than she'd expected. She woke before dawn to make breakfast, learned to feed the chickens without getting pecked, discovered that laundry in a washtub was 10 times harder than it looked. Her hands blistered, then calloused. Her back ached from unfamiliar work, but she didn't complain. Caleb watched her. She felt his attention even when he wasn't looking directly at her, a kind of quiet assessment that might have made her nervous if it hadn't felt so genuinely curious rather than judgmental. He taught her things as they worked, how to read weather in the clouds, how to tell good grazing land from poor, how to spot when a fence needed repair before it failed completely. And slowly, in the spaces between work, they talked. Not the careful, formal exchanges of their letters, but real conversation, halting at first, then easier. Lila told him about Philadelphia, about her parents' deaths, about the suffocating expectations of her aunt's house. Caleb talked about his father, about inheriting the ranch at 17, about the loneliness that had settled in so gradually he hadn't noticed it until it consumed everything. I tried once, he said one evening as they sat on the porch after supper, watching the sun set. To marry, local girl, Sarah Hutchins. Lila's chest tightened at the name, but she kept her voice neutral. What happened? She came out to see the ranch, spent about 3 hours here, and decided she couldn't live this far from town, said it was too isolated, too rough, he paused, too lonely. She married a banker in San Antonio 6 months later. I'm sorry. Caleb shrugged, but Lila could see the old hurt beneath the gesture. She wasn't wrong. It is lonely out here. I hoped that if it was the right person, maybe the loneliness wouldn't matter as much. Is that why you placed the advertisement? Lila asked quietly. Because you wanted someone who chose this life deliberately, instead of someone who just ended up here? Something like that? Caleb's gaze was distant, fixed on the horizon. I figured if someone was willing to come all this way based on letters alone, they were either desperate or brave. And I was hoping for brave. What if I'm both? Caleb looked at her then, his expression unguarded in the fading light. Then you might actually survive here. The words should have stung, but somehow they didn't. They felt like honesty, the kind Lila had been craving her entire life. On Sunday, Wade drove Lila into Willow Creek, the real Willow Creek, 5 miles south of the crossroads where she'd been stranded. The town was small but bustling, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a central square. There was a general store, a bank, a saloon, a church with a white steeple, and a handful of other establishments that suggested civilization, however tentative. Caleb asked me to introduce you around, Wade said as they climbed down from the wagon. Figured you might want to meet some of the ladies, see the place in daylight instead of during a storm. Lila appreciated the gesture, even as nervousness twisted in her stomach. She'd faced judgmental society women in Philadelphia. Surely Texas couldn't be worse. She was wrong. The women of Willow Creek descended on her like a flock of curious, gossiping birds the moment Wade escorted her into the general store. Within minutes, Lila was surrounded by a half-dozen faces, all of them assessing her with varying degrees of friendliness and suspicion. So you're the mail-order bride, one woman said, tall, thin, with sharp eyes and a sharper smile. I'm Martha Jenkins. My husband owns the bank. Lila Hart, Lila said, extending her hand. Martha shook it briefly, her grip perfunctory. We heard Caleb finally gave up on finding someone local, another woman chimed in. Younger, prettier, with blonde curls and a saccharine voice. I'm Caroline Pierce. My father runs the saloon. It's nice to meet you both. Lila kept her tone polite, neutral, even as she felt the weight of their scrutiny. You're from Philadelphia? Martha's voice dripped with skepticism. Must be quite a change coming from a big city to... She waved her hand vaguely. This. It is, Lila agreed, but not an unwelcome one. Really? Caroline's smile was all teeth. You don't miss civilization, culture, society? I miss some things, Lila said carefully, but I'm discovering new things I appreciate here. Such as? Martha pressed. Honesty, Lila said, meeting her eyes directly. People say what they mean out here. I find that refreshing. A flicker of surprise crossed Martha's face, followed quickly by calculation. Before she could respond, an older woman pushed through the crowd, gray-haired, sturdy, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. All right, ladies, give the poor girl some air. She turned to Lila with a warm smile. I'm Dorothy Brennan. My husband and I run the ranch north of Caleb's property. Welcome to Willow Creek, Miss Hart. Thank you. Lila felt some of her tension ease. And please call me Lila. Dorothy nodded approvingly. Lila it is. Now, I heard about the barn fire. Terrible business. How's Caleb holding up? He's managing, Lila said. We're all working to get things back in order. We? Martha's tone was sharp. You mean you're actually helping with ranch work? Of course. Lila kept her voice even, despite the implied criticism. Why wouldn't I? Well, it's just most women who come out here as mail-order brides don't expect to work like hired hands. They expect to keep house and... Martha, Dorothy interrupted, her voice firm. That's enough. Martha's mouth snapped shut, but her expression remained sour. Caroline, meanwhile, was studying Lila with undisguised interest. "You know," Caroline said slowly, "Caleb courted me once, 2 years ago, before Sarah Hutchins." The information landed like a stone. Lila kept her expression carefully neutral. "Did he?" Took me to a church social, bought me dinner at the hotel. Very attentive." Caroline's smile turned sly. "But I could tell his heart wasn't in it. Too closed off, always holding something back. I broke it off after a month." "That was wise of you," Lila said quietly. "It's better to end things than to settle for someone you're not truly connected to." Caroline blinked, clearly not expecting agreement. Dorothy let out a small huff of amusement. "Smart girl," Dorothy murmured. Then, louder, "Lila, why don't you come by for tea sometime this week? I'd love to hear more about Philadelphia, and I can tell you which families around here are worth knowing." "I'd like that very much." Lila felt a rush of gratitude toward this woman who'd just thrown her a lifeline. "Excellent. Wade can bring you over Tuesday afternoon if Caleb can spare you." Dorothy shot a pointed look at Martha and Caroline. "Now, if you ladies will excuse us, I need to show Lila where to find the good fabric. Can't have her wearing those travel clothes forever." Dorothy steered Lila toward the back of the store, away from the cluster of women, and Lila let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Don't mind them," Dorothy said quietly. "Martha's bitter because her husband gambles away half their money, and Caroline's never forgiven any man for not choosing her. They'll warm up eventually, or they won't. Either way, you'll survive." "Thank you," Lila said, "for intervening." "It's nothing." Dorothy's expression softened. "I was a mail-order bride myself, 30 years ago. Came out from Boston to marry a rancher I'd never met. Best decision I ever made, but those first few months were hell. The town women treated me like I was either a saint or a fool, and I couldn't figure out which was worse." "How did you get through it?" "Stubbornness, mostly. And a husband who made it clear to everyone that I was his partner, not his property." Dorothy paused, studying Lila's face. "Caleb's a good man. Quiet, keeps to himself too much, but solid. If he chose you, he saw something worth choosing." The words wrapped around Lila like a warm coat. "I hope you're right." "I usually am," Dorothy smiled. "Now let's find you some decent fabric before Martha comes back and tries to sell you something hideous out of spite." By the time Wade was ready to leave town, Lila had acquired fabric for 2 new dresses, met what felt like half the population of Willow Creek, and developed a headache from smiling through thinly veiled criticism. But she'd also made one genuine friend in Dorothy, and that felt like a victory. On the ride back to the ranch, Wade was uncharacteristically quiet. Finally, he said, "They give you a hard time?" "Some of them," Lila admitted, "but Mrs. Brennan was kind." "Dorothy's good people." Wade was silent for a moment, then added, "Caroline Pierce is full of hot air, She didn't break things off with Caleb. He ended it because she spent the entire evening talking about how much she hated ranch life and couldn't wait to move to Dallas." Lila felt something unclench in her chest. He didn't seem heartbroken about it in her version. Because he wasn't. Caleb's been looking for something real for a long time. He's just not good at spotting it when it's dressed up in pretty lies. Wade glanced at her. "But you don't lie, do you, Miss Hart?" "I try not to." "Good. Keep it that way. Caleb needs someone who'll be straight with him, even when it's hard." They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, and when the ranch came into view, Lila felt something she hadn't expected. She felt like she was coming home. That night, after supper, Caleb found her on the porch. She was mending one of his shirts, a task she'd taken on without being asked, her needle moving in small, precise stitches. "You don't have to do that," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "I know, but it needs doing, and I'm capable of doing it." Lila tied off a thread and examined her work. "Besides, I met half the town today. Apparently I'm supposed to prove I'm not just decorative." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Who said that?" "No one directly, but the implication was clear." Lila set the shirt aside and looked at him. "Caroline Pierce told me you courted her." "Briefly, 2 years ago." Caleb's expression was carefully neutral. "It didn't work out." "She said you were too closed off." She said I didn't talk enough about my feelings. Same thing, I suppose. Lila studied his face, the careful guard he kept up, the walls she could sense even when he was trying to be open. Are you closed off? Caleb was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost reluctant. I don't know how to be any other way. My father wasn't a man who talked about what he felt. You worked, you survived, you kept moving forward. That's what I learned. And when you're lonely, or scared, or grieving, you work harder. Caleb's smile was humorless. It's not a great system, but it's kept me going. Lila reached out and placed her hand over his. A simple gesture, but deliberate. Caleb looked down at their joined hands, surprise flickering across his face. You don't have to be that way with me, Lila said quietly. I'm not asking you to pour out your heart every evening, but if we're going to build something real, you need to let me in sometimes, even when it's uncomfortable. Caleb's hand turned beneath hers, his fingers curling around her palm. His grip was warm, slightly rough from work, and achingly human. I'm trying, he said finally. It's just different, harder than I expected. Most worthwhile things are. They sat together as darkness settled over the ranch, hands linked, saying nothing, and somehow that felt like enough. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after the barn fire. Wade brought it back from town along with supplies, and the moment Lila saw the handwriting on the envelope, her stomach dropped. Her aunt's script was unmistakable, sharp, precise, each letter formed with the kind of rigid perfection that suggested control extended even to penmanship. Lila stood in the kitchen, the envelope heavy in her hands, while Caleb and Wade unloaded lumber for the new barn frame. She should have expected this, should have known that her aunt wouldn't simply let her disappear into Texas without some final attempt at reclamation. But holding the physical evidence of that world she'd left behind made her hands shake. You all right? Caleb's voice came from the doorway, concern evident in his tone. Lila turned, the letter still unopened. It's from my aunt. Caleb's expression shifted, not quite hardening, but becoming more alert, protective. You want privacy to read it? No? The word came out more forcefully than she intended. Actually, I think I'd rather you stayed, if that's all right. He nodded and moved to the table, settling into a chair but maintaining a respectful distance. Lila took a breath, broke the seal, and unfolded the single sheet of expensive stationery. The words were exactly what she'd feared. Lila, your reckless decision to abandon your family and your responsibilities has brought shame upon this household. I have had to explain to our entire social circle that my niece chose to degrade herself by answering an advertisement like common goods for sale. The humiliation is beyond measure. However, I am willing to forgive this temporary madness. Return home immediately. I have spoken with Reverend Clark, and he has agreed to overlook this incident if you demonstrate proper contrition. There is still time to salvage your reputation if you act now. If you persist in this foolishness, you will be formally disowned. You will receive nothing from your parents' estate, nothing from this family, and nothing from me. You will be entirely alone, dependent on a stranger in a wilderness, with no education, no prospects, and no future. Choose wisely. Your Aunt Margaret Lila read it twice, her vision blurring slightly on the second pass. The words were designed to wound, to terrify, to manipulate. And they worked. That old fear rose up in her chest, the terror of being completely alone, of having burned every bridge, of having nowhere to go if this didn't work out. Lila, Caleb's voice was gentle but firm. What does it say? She handed him the letter without speaking, unable to trust her voice. Caleb read it slowly, his jaw tightening with each line. When he finished, he set it down very carefully, as if it might explode. He stopped himself, clearly editing his first response. That's manipulative. It's effective. Lila's voice came out small, defeated. She knows exactly what scares me. Being alone? Being nothing. Lila wrapped her arms around herself. My whole life I was told my value came from my family, my connections, my position in society, and I believed it. Even when I hated it, I believed it. She looked at Caleb, tears threatening. What if she's right? What if I'm throwing away everything real for something that doesn't exist? Caleb stood and crossed to her, his movements deliberate and slow. He stopped close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the concern written across his weathered face. "Can I tell you what I see?" he asked quietly. Lila nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "I see a woman who traveled 1,000 miles alone to claim a life she wanted instead of accepting one she was handed. I see someone who stood in a storm and didn't break, who helped fight a barn fire instead of hiding, who learned to ride a horse and feed chickens and make bread that's better than anything I could manage." His voice was steady, certain. "I see someone real, Lila. More real than anyone I've met in years. Your aunt's wrong. You're not nothing. You're brave." The tears spilled over then, hot and fast. Lila tried to wipe them away, embarrassed, but Caleb caught her hands. "Hey, it's all right. You're allowed to be scared." "I don't want to be scared anymore," Lila said, her voice breaking. "I'm tired of being afraid." "Then don't answer her letter." Caleb's grip on her hands tightened slightly. "Or answer it and tell her the truth. That you chose this. That you're staying. That she has no power over you anymore." Lila looked up at him through her tears, seeing the absolute conviction in his expression. He believed every word he'd said. He believed in her even when she struggled to believe in herself. "What if I fail?" she whispered. "What if I can't do this?" "What if you can?" Caleb's thumb brushed across her knuckles, the gesture achingly tender. "What if you're exactly where you're supposed to be, and the only thing holding you back is the voice of someone who never wanted you to succeed in the first place?" The words landed like a key turning in a lock. Something inside Lila shifted, settled, found solid ground. She took a shaky breath, then another, and felt the fear begin to recede. "I'm not going back," she said, testing the words. "I'm staying here." "You sure?" "Yes." And she was. The certainty felt like light breaking through clouds, warm and undeniable. "I'm sure." Caleb smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "Good, because I'd have hated to lose you to Philadelphia." Lila laughed despite her tears, the sound watery but real. "You would have survived." "Maybe, but I wouldn't have liked it." He released her hand slowly, as if reluctant to break the contact. "You want help writing a response?" "No." Lila looked at the letter on the table, at her aunt's perfect, poisonous script. "I think I know exactly what to say." She sat down and pulled out a sheet of paper, her hand steady as she wrote. "Aunt Margaret, I am not returning to Philadelphia. This is not temporary madness or reckless foolishness. It is a deliberate choice made by an adult woman who has every right to determine her own future. You have spent years telling me I was a burden, an embarrassment, a disappointment. I have finally realized that the problem was never me. It was your inability to accept anyone who didn't conform to your narrow definition of acceptable. I am building a life here that feels honest and real. I am learning, growing, and discovering strengths I never knew I had. I am not degrading myself. I am elevating myself beyond the suffocating expectations you tried to impose. You may disown me if you wish. I release you from any obligation toward me, as I hope you will release me from any obligation toward you. I wish you well, but I will not be returning. Lila Hart. She read it over twice, making small edits, then folded it carefully and sealed it in an envelope. Her hands were steady, her breathing was calm. She felt, for the first time in years, like she was standing on solid ground instead of constantly scrambling for purchase. "Done?" Caleb asked. "Done." Lila set the envelope aside. "Wade can mail it when he goes to town tomorrow." "How do you feel?" Lila considered the question seriously. "Free," she said finally. "Terrified, but free." "That's a good combination." Caleb moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you're staying. Even though you barely know me, I'm getting to know you." His expression was open, honest. "And I like what I'm learning." The words settled around Lila like a promise, and she carried them with her through the rest of the day. That afternoon, Dorothy Brennan arrived in a wagon loaded with quilts and a determination to help the poor girl settle in properly. She swept into the house like a benevolent storm, took one look at Lila's sparse bedroom, and declared it sadder than a funeral. Every woman needs something beautiful around her, Dorothy announced, spreading a gorgeous patchwork quilt across the bed, blues and greens and golds that caught the light like water. This was my wedding quilt. My mother made it, and I want you to have it. I can't, Lila started, overwhelmed. You can, and you will. Dorothy's tone brooked no argument. Consider it a welcome gift. Now, show me what fabric you bought in town, and we'll figure out what dresses to make first. They spent the afternoon cutting patterns and pinning fabric, Dorothy sharing a running commentary on every family in Willow Creek, who could be trusted, who was all talk, who made the best preserves, and who watered down their milk. It was gossipy and generous, and exactly what Lila needed. Martha Jenkins is going to make your life difficult, Dorothy said matter-of-factly as she measured Lila's waist. She wanted Caleb for her daughter 3 years ago, and she's never forgiven him for not being interested. But she's all bark. Just smile and ignore her. What about Caroline Pierce? Caroline wants what she can't have. The minute she decided Caleb was too boring for her, he became fascinating. Dorothy pinned the fabric with practiced efficiency. She'll test you, try to make you jealous, but it's all performance. Don't give her the satisfaction of reacting. You're very good at this, Lila said, reading people. 30 years in a small town will do that. Dorothy sat back, examining her work. You learn to see past what people say to what they mean. And most people mean well, even when they're being idiots about it. Do you think they'll accept me? Eventually? Dorothy's expression softened. Honey, you've already done the hardest part. You showed up. You didn't run when the barn burned. You're working instead of playing helpless, and you're standing up to Caleb when he needs it. That's more than most mail-order brides manage in their first month. She paused. Give it time. Respect has to be earned out here, but once you earn it, it sticks. As the sun began to set, Dorothy packed up her supplies and prepared to leave. At the door, she turned and took both of Lila's hands in hers. You're going to be just fine, she said firmly. And if you ever need anything, advice, help, or just someone to complain to about stubborn men, you come find me. Understood? Understood. Lila squeezed her hands. Thank you, Dorothy, for everything. It's what neighbors do. Dorothy smiled. Now go make that man of yours some supper. He looks half-starved. After Dorothy left, Lila stood in her bedroom and looked at the wedding quilt spread across the bed. It was beautiful, yes, but more than that. It was a symbol of acceptance, of welcome, of belonging. Someone believed she would stay. Someone believed she deserved beautiful things. That night, over a simple dinner of beef stew and cornbread, Caleb told her about the plans for the new barn. Wade had drawn up designs. They'd sourced lumber from a mill in San Antonio, and construction would begin next week. It would take most of the summer, but by fall they'd have a structure even better than what they'd lost. I was thinking, Caleb said, pushing food around his plate, in a way that suggested nervousness. When we build the house, if we build a new house in the future, maybe you'd want to have some say in the design. You know, where the kitchen is, how big the rooms are, that kind of thing. Lila's heart skipped. You're thinking about building a new house? Not immediately, but eventually. This one's solid enough, but it was built for one person. If we're going to be... He stopped, color rising in his cheeks. If this works out the way I hope it does, we might need more space. For what? Caleb met her eyes, and Lila saw hope and fear and possibility all tangled together in his expression. For a family, if that's something you'd want. The question hung between them, weighted with significance. Lila thought about her aunt's letter, about the life she'd left behind, about standing in this kitchen making bread and feeling more at home than she ever had in Philadelphia. Yes, she said simply, that's something I'd want. Relief flooded Caleb's face, followed quickly by something that looked almost like joy. Yeah? Yeah. Lila smiled, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. But first we should probably finish the 2 months you promised me. Make sure we're not making decisions based on hope instead of reality. Fair enough. Caleb's smile lingered. Though for the record, I'm already pretty sure about the reality. Are you? Yeah. His voice was quiet but certain. I am. They finished dinner in comfortable silence, and later, as Lila washed dishes and Caleb dried, she thought about how natural it felt, this rhythm they were building, this partnership taking shape in small, ordinary moments. The wedding was set for 6 weeks out, on a Saturday in late June. The decision came gradually, organically, through a series of conversations that felt less like negotiations and more like two people discovering they wanted the same things. "We could wait longer," Caleb had said one evening. "Take the full 2 months if you want." "I don't think I need 2 months," Lila had replied. "I think I already know." "You sure? I don't want you to feel rushed." I don't feel rushed. I feel certain." And she had. The certainty had grown day by day, built from a foundation of honest work and genuine conversation and moments of unexpected tenderness that took her breath away. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a blur of activity. The new barn frame went up, Wade proving himself a skilled carpenter alongside being a capable ranch hand. Lila sewed her wedding dress from the fabric Dorothy had helped her choose, a simple design in cream-colored cotton, practical but pretty. She learned to manage the household finances, to preserve vegetables from the garden, to anticipate what Caleb needed before he asked. And somewhere in all of that ordinary work, something extraordinary happened. They fell in love. Not the dramatic, sweeping romance of novels, but something quieter and more durable. It happened in small moments. Caleb teaching her to handle the rifle so she could protect herself if needed, then patiently correcting her stance with gentle touches. Lila reading aloud in the evenings while Caleb worked on tack repair, his hands stilling occasionally as he listened to her voice. The way they'd developed a habit of sitting together on the porch after supper, talking about everything and nothing until the stars came out. It happened in the way Caleb started leaving wildflowers on the kitchen table, never with explanation, just small bursts of color that said, "I was thinking of you." In the way Lila learned to read his moods, to know when he needed space and when he needed company, to push him toward openness without demanding more than he could give. It happened in trust, built slowly and carefully, until Lila realized one morning that she trusted this man with her life, her future, her heart. But 2 days before the wedding, disaster struck again. Lila was in the garden, harvesting tomatoes in the early morning cool, when she heard shouting from the south pasture. She dropped her basket and ran toward the sound, her heart hammering with sudden fear. She found Wade first, running toward the house, his face pale. "What happened?" Lila grabbed his arm. "Wade, what's wrong?" "Caleb, there was a young bull, broke through the fence, went crazy. Caleb got between him and one of the calves, and the bull charged." Wade was breathing hard, his words tumbling over each other. "He's hurt bad, Lila. Real bad." The world seemed to tilt. Lila forced herself to think clearly despite the panic clawing at her chest. "Where is he?" "South pasture. I tied off the worst of it, but he's bleeding heavy and—" Lila was already running. She found him lying in the grass, his shirt soaked red, Wade's bandana wrapped tight around his ribs. Caleb's face was gray with pain, his breathing shallow and rapid. When he saw her, he tried to sit up. "Stay down," Lila ordered, dropping to her knees beside him. Her hand shook as she examined the wound, a deep gash along his right side, ugly and bleeding despite Wade's makeshift bandage. "What were you thinking, getting between a bull and a calf?" "Couldn't let him hurt the baby." Caleb's words came out between gasps. "Worth more than me." "Don't you dare say that!" Lila's voice cracked. "Don't you dare!" She turned to Wade, who'd caught up to them. "We need to get him to the house. Can you bring the wagon? It'll take 10 minutes. Then run." Lila's hands pressed against the wound, trying to slow the bleeding. "Go!" Wade ran, and Lila was left alone with Caleb, watching his life seep into the Texas dirt, and she realized with crystalline clarity that she couldn't lose him. Not now. Not after she'd finally found something real. "Stay with me," she said, her voice fierce. "Caleb, look at me. Stay with me." His eyes found hers, hazy with pain. "Lila, save your strength. Don't talk. Need to say—" He coughed, winced. "If something happens, nothing's going to happen." But fear made her voice shake. "You're going to be fine." "Lila." His hand found hers, his grip weak but deliberate. "The ranch. It's yours. Papers in the desk. Made Wade witness. Everything goes to you, sah." stop it. Tears blurred her vision. Stop planning your funeral and focus on staying alive. Trying, another cough, more blood. But just in case, need you to know, best decision I ever made, bringing you here. Caleb, please, love you. The words came out barely above a whisper. Should have said it sooner, but I do. I love you. Lila's tears fell hot and fast, landing on their joined hands. Then stay alive so you can tell me again. Stay alive so we can get married and build that house and have that family. Stay alive, damn you, because I love you too, and I am not doing this alone. She didn't know if he heard her. His eyes had closed, his breathing gone shallow and thready. Wade arrived with the wagon, and together they lifted Caleb, careful, so careful, and laid him in the back. There's a doctor in Willow Creek, Wade said, his voice tight with worry. But it's 5 miles, and over rough road, then drive fast. Lila climbed into the wagon beside Caleb, her hand pressing against the wound, feeling his life pulse warm and terrifying against her palm. And don't stop for anything. The ride to town was the longest of Lila's life. She crouched beside Caleb in the wagon bed, talking to him constantly, about the wedding, about the barn, about all the tomorrows they were going to have together, not knowing if he could hear but refusing to let silence take him. At one point his eyes opened briefly. Lila, I'm here. I'm right here. The wedding, we're not postponing it, Lila said firmly, though her voice shook. You promised me a wedding in 2 days, Caleb Wren, and you are going to keep that promise. Do you hear me? You're going to stand up in that church and marry me, or I swear I will follow you into whatever comes next and drag you back myself. His mouth quirked, barely, but it was there, a ghost of a smile. And then his eyes closed again, and Lila could only pray they'd open one more time. They reached Willow Creek in record time. Wade pulled up outside the doctor's office, and within minutes they had Caleb inside, laid out on an examination table while a gray-haired man with steady hands and kind eyes began cutting away his shirt. You his wife? The doctor asked Lila. Almost. Her voice was steady despite the terror churning inside her. We're supposed to get married on Saturday. Well then. The doctor examined the wound, his expression grave. Let's make sure he makes it to Saturday. This is going to take some time, and it won't be pretty. You might want to wait outside. I'm staying. Lila met his eyes. I need to be here. The doctor studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, but I'm going to need your help. Can you do that? Stay calm and do exactly what I tell you? Lila thought about every challenge she'd faced since stepping off that stagecoach. The storm, the fire, the judgment of strangers, the letter from her aunt. She'd survived all of it. She could survive this too. Yes, she said firmly. Tell me what to do. The doctor's name was Samuel Pierce, no relation to Caroline, he assured Lila with a wry smile, and his hands moved with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from 30 years of frontier medicine. Lila stood beside him, her own hands steady despite the fear coursing through her veins, and did exactly what he told her to do. She held clean cloths. She handed him instruments. She kept pressure on bleeding vessels while he worked, and she didn't look away, not once, even when the wound revealed itself in all its brutal reality, deep and ragged, the bull's horn having torn through muscle and narrowly missed vital organs. He's lucky, Dr. Pierce said as he began stitching, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. Another inch to the left and we wouldn't be having this conversation. As it is, he's lost a lot of blood, but if infection doesn't set in, he should pull through. Should? Lila's voice was tight. I won't lie to you, Miss Hart. The next 48 hours are critical. If he develops fever, if the wound shows signs of infection, we'll deal with that if it happens. But right now I'm cautiously optimistic. He glanced at her, his expression kind. You did well out there. That bandage Wade tied probably saved his life. And getting him here as fast as you did, that matters. Lila nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She focused on Caleb's face instead, still too pale, but peaceful now, the pain temporarily erased by the laudanum Dr. Pierce had administered. His chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, and she counted each breath like a prayer. The stitching took over an hour. Dr. Pierce worked with meticulous care, closing the wound in layers, ensuring everything aligned properly to promote healing. When he finally tied off the last suture and stepped back, His shirt was stained with blood and his face lined with exhaustion. "There," he said quietly. "That's the best I can do. Now we wait and see if his body cooperates." "Can I stay with him?" Lila asked. "I'd prefer you did. He needs to be watched closely for the next few days. Any sign of fever, any change in his breathing, you come get me immediately. I live 2 doors down." Dr. Pierce began cleaning his instruments, his movements automatic. "There's a cot in the back room. You can sleep there when you need to." "Thank you." The words felt inadequate for what this man had just done, but they were all Lila had. Dr. Pierce paused, looking at her with something that might have been respect. "You love him." It wasn't a question, but Lila answered anyway. "Yes, I do." "Good. That'll help more than any medicine I can give him." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "For what it's worth, Miss Hart, Caleb's a fighter. I've patched him up twice before, once after a horse threw him into a fence, once after he nearly froze trying to rescue cattle in a blizzard. He's stubborn as hell and too ornery to die easy. Have faith in that." After Dr. Pierce left, Lila pulled a chair close to Caleb's side and took his hand. His skin was cool, clammy, but his pulse beat steady beneath her fingers. She sat there in the quiet afternoon light, listening to him breathe, and let herself finally feel the terror she'd been holding back. She'd almost lost him. Before she'd even fully claimed him, before they'd built anything lasting, before she'd had the chance to tell him all the things that mattered, she'd almost lost him. The realization broke something open inside her. Lila pressed her forehead against their joined hands and let the tears come, silent and wrenching, releasing hours of fear and adrenaline and desperate hope. Wade found her like that 20 minutes later. He stood in the doorway, his own face haggard, and when Lila looked up, she saw guilt written across his features. "I should have been faster," Wade said hoarsely. "Should have gotten to him before the bull." "Stop!" Lila's voice was firm despite her tears. "This isn't your fault. Caleb made a choice, and—" Her voice caught. "And he's going to be fine. He has to be." Wade moved into the room, his eyes on Caleb's still form. "I've known him 10 years. Best man I ever met. Fair, honest, works harder than anyone I've seen, and he's been alone all that time, except for me and the cattle and this land." He looked at Lila. "Then you came, and I watched him change. Start smiling more. Start talking about the future like it was something worth planning for. You gave him hope, Miss Hart, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let him lose that now." Lila swallowed hard. "The ranch? Someone needs to check on the herd, make sure." "Already done. I got the Brennan's oldest boy watching things until we get back." "Everything's secure." Wade pulled up another chair, settling in with the air of a man prepared to stay as long as necessary. "I'm not leaving either of you alone right now." They kept vigil together through the afternoon and into the evening. Dorothy arrived at sunset carrying a basket of food and an expression of fierce determination. "I heard what happened," she said, sweeping into the room like a force of nature. "Half the town's heard by now. How is he?" "Stable," Lila said. "The doctor says the next 2 days are critical." Dorothy set down her basket and came to stand beside Lila, one hand resting gently on her shoulder. "He's strong. He'll pull through." "Everyone keeps saying that," Lila's voice wavered. "But what if he doesn't? What if I came all this way just to—" "Hush now." Dorothy's grip tightened, grounding. "No what ifs. We deal with what is, not what might be. Right now, Caleb's alive. The doctor says he should recover, and you're here with him. That's what matters." Over the next 2 days, Willow Creek proved itself to be more than just a collection of buildings and strangers. People came in a steady stream, bringing food, offering prayers, sitting quiet vigil. The Brennans sent their son to help Wade with the ranch work. Martha Jenkins, despite her earlier coldness, arrived with fresh bandages and homemade salve. Even Caroline Pierce showed up, subdued and genuine for once, to tell Lila that Caleb deserved someone who fought for him the way she was fighting. "I was wrong about him," Caroline said quietly, standing at the foot of Caleb's bed. "I thought he was boring because he didn't perform for me. But he's not boring, he's real. And I was too shallow to see it." She looked at Lila. "Don't let him go. Men like that don't come around often." "I don't intend to," Lila said. Throughout it all, Lila barely left Caleb's side. She slept in snatches on the cot Dr. Pierce had provided, woke at every sound, monitored his breathing and pulse with obsessive attention. She bathed his face with cool cloths, changed his bandages under Dr. Pierce's supervision, and talked to him constantly about the wedding, about the ranch, about all the ordinary, beautiful future they were going to share. On the second night, Caleb's fever spiked. Lila woke to find him burning hot to the touch, his skin flushed and dry, his breathing rapid and shallow. Terror seized her chest, but she forced herself to move calmly, efficiently. She woke Wade, sent him running for Dr. Pierce, and began the work of trying to bring the fever down. Cool cloths, careful sips of water when Caleb's eyes flickered open in confusion, steady hands even when she wanted to scream. Dr. Pierce arrived within minutes, his expression grave as he examined Caleb. Infection's trying to set in. Not unexpected, but we need to fight it hard. Miss Hart, I need you to keep him cool and hydrated. I'll prepare a stronger tincture, but ultimately, his body has to do the work. The night stretched endless. Lila worked without pause, changing cloths, offering water, monitoring every minute change in Caleb's condition. Wade and Dorothy both tried to relieve her, but she refused. This was her vigil, her fight, her love lying there struggling for each breath. Somewhere around 3 a.m, Caleb's eyes opened, truly opened, focused and aware for the first time in 2 days. Lila? His voice was barely a whisper, rough from disuse. She was at his side immediately, her hand finding his. I'm here. I'm right here. What happened? You got yourself gored by a bull, you idiot! Lila's voice shook with relief and residual fear. You've been unconscious for 2 days. You have a fever, and you're supposed to be getting married tomorrow, so you need to start getting better right now. Caleb's mouth twitched, barely, but it was there, that ghost of a smile she'd come to recognize and cherish. Bossy, you have no idea. Lila pressed a cool cloth to his forehead. How do you feel? Like I got gored by a bull. He winced, tried to shift, then gave up. The ranch. Wade's handling it. Everything's fine. You just focus on healing. The wedding, we're postponing it. Lila kept her voice firm, though the words hurt to say. You need to recover properly, not push yourself before you're ready. No. Caleb's grip on her hand strengthened slightly. Saturday. I want Saturday. Caleb, you can barely lift your head. You're not getting married in a church while you're running a fever and held together with stitches. Then not church. His eyes held hers, determined despite his weakness. Here, doctor's office. Just us and Wade and whoever else matters. Don't need fancy. Just need you. Lila's throat closed with emotion. You're serious. Always serious about you. She looked at this stubborn, impossible man and felt her resistance crumble. If he wanted to marry her from a sickbed with a fever and 20 stitches in his side, who was she to argue? Life was too short, too uncertain, too precious to waste time waiting for perfect circumstances. All right, she said softly. Saturday. But if you collapse during the vows, I'm going to be very upset with you. Deal. Caleb's eyes drifted closed, exhausted from even that brief conversation, but his hand remained linked with hers. Love you. I love you too. Lila pressed a kiss to his knuckles. Now sleep. And get better. Because I refuse to be a widow before I'm even properly a wife. By morning, the fever had broken. Caleb woke clearer, stronger, asking for water and actual food instead of broth. Dr. Pierce examined him thoroughly and pronounced himself cautiously pleased. You're not out of danger yet, the doctor warned. But you're through the worst of it. No strenuous activity for at least 6 weeks, and I mean it, Caleb. No riding, no heavy lifting, no ranch work. You push yourself too soon, that wound will reopen, and next time you might not be so lucky. Understood, Caleb said, though Lila could see the frustration in his eyes at the idea of being sidelined for that long. I'll make sure he follows orders, Lila said firmly, even if I have to tie him to the bed. Dr. Pierce laughed. I believe you would. All right then, keep the wound clean, change the bandages twice daily, and if you see any signs of infection, redness, heat, unusual swelling. You come find me immediately." He looked between them. "And congratulations. I hear there's going to be a wedding tomorrow." Word spread through Willow Creek faster than wildfire. By noon, Dorothy had mobilized half the town's women to prepare for an impromptu wedding in Dr. Pierce's office. Lila tried to protest. This was too much trouble, too much fuss. But Dorothy waved her off. "Nonsense. You two deserve a proper celebration, even if it's happening in unconventional circumstances. Now, is your dress finished?" It was, barely. Lila had completed the last stitches 2 nights before Caleb's injury, never imagining she'd be wearing it under these circumstances. Dorothy pressed it carefully, arranged for wildflowers to be gathered, and somehow procured a small cake from the hotel kitchen. "It's not much," Dorothy said as she surveyed the transformed doctor's office on Saturday morning, "but it's real, and that's what matters." The office had been cleaned until it gleamed, the harsh medical smell covered by the scent of wildflowers arranged in every available container. Someone had found white fabric to drape over the examination table where Caleb would sit, making it look less like a sickbed and more like a place for new beginnings. Lila dressed carefully in the small back room, her fingers trembling slightly as she fastened the buttons on her cream dress. It was simple, practical, exactly what she'd envisioned, but beautiful too, in an honest way that felt right. She'd braided wildflowers into her hair, and when she looked at herself in the small mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. This wasn't the frightened girl who'd stepped off the stagecoach 2 months ago. This was someone stronger, sure, ready to claim the life she'd chosen. Dorothy appeared in the doorway, tears in her eyes. "Oh, honey, you're beautiful." "I'm terrified," Lila admitted. "That's how you know it matters." Dorothy came forward, adjusting a flower in Lila's hair with gentle fingers. "But you're not walking into this blind. You know this man. You've seen him at his worst and his best. You've fought beside him, worked beside him, nearly lost him. If you're still sure after all that, then this is the rightest decision you'll ever make." "I'm sure," Lila said. And she was. Despite everything, or maybe because of everything, she was absolutely certain. The ceremony was small and perfect. Caleb sat propped against pillows on the draped examination table, dressed in a clean white shirt and dark trousers, his face still pale, but his eyes clear and bright with emotion. Wade stood beside him, cleaned up and solemn. Dorothy held Lila's bouquet of wildflowers. Dr. Pierce served as witness. The minister from the church performed the ceremony with kindness and brevity, understanding that the groom's strength was limited. When it came time for vows, Caleb spoke first, his voice quiet but unwavering. "Lila Hart, I'm not good with words, never have been, but I can tell you this. From the moment I read your first letter, something in me recognized something in you. A kind of honesty, a kind of courage, that I'd been looking for without knowing how to name it. You came here on faith, worked beside me without complaint, stayed through fire and fear and every reason you had to leave. You make me want to be better than I am. You make this ranch feel like home instead of just land. I promise to be your partner in everything, work, joy, hardship, hope. I promise to be honest with you, even when it's hard. I promise to love you with everything I have, for as long as I'm breathing." He paused, his eyes bright, which, thanks to you, is going to be a good long while. Lila's tears came freely, but her voice was steady as she spoke her own vows. "Caleb Wren, I left everything I knew to find something real, and I found it in you, in your honesty, your strength, your quiet kindness that you think no one notices but everyone does. You gave me space to become who I was meant to be. You trusted me before I trusted myself. You made me brave." Her voice caught, but she pushed through. "I promise to stand beside you in everything, to work when work is needed, to rest when rest is needed, to speak truth even when it's uncomfortable. I promise to love this land with you, to build this life with you, to choose you every single day for all the days we have. You're not alone anymore, Caleb, and neither am I. We're home." The minister pronounced them husband and wife, and when Caleb pulled Lila close for their first kiss as a married couple, careful of his injury but determined nonetheless, the small gathering erupted in cheers and applause. They cut the cake with Caleb sitting and Lila standing beside him, their hands linked on the knife. They accepted congratulations and well wishes from the handful of people who'd gathered to witness their union. And when it was finally over, when the last guest had left and quiet settled over the doctor's office, Caleb looked at Lila with an expression of wonder. "We did it," he said softly. "We did." Lila perched carefully on the edge of the examination table beside him, mindful of his injury. "How do you feel?" "Like the luckiest man in Texas." He caught her hand, threading their fingers together. "I know this wasn't the wedding you imagined. No church, no celebration, me half dead on a makeshift bed." "It was perfect," Lila interrupted, "because it was real, because everyone who mattered was there, because you kept your promise." She leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "Now you need to rest. Doctor's orders." "I've been resting for 3 days. And you'll be resting for 6 more weeks. Get used to it, husband." Caleb groaned but didn't argue. Lila helped him settle more comfortably, adjusting pillows, checking his bandages with the expertise she'd learned over the past few days. When he was situated, she pulled her chair close and took his hand again. "Tell me about the house," she said. "The one we're going to build. What does it look like?" Caleb's eyes lit up despite his exhaustion. "Big kitchen, with windows that get morning light. You said you wanted that." "I did. What else?" "A real bedroom upstairs, with space for—" He paused, color rising in his pale cheeks. "For a family. Eventually." "Eventually," Lila agreed, her heart full. "What about the porch?" "Wraps all the way around, so we can watch the sunset from any direction." His voice was getting drowsy, the day's excitement catching up with him. "And a room for your books. You'll want that." "I will." Lila watched his eyes drift closed, his breathing evening out into sleep. "I love you, Caleb Wren." His lips curved in a smile. "Love you too, Mrs. Wren." The name sent a thrill through her. Mrs. Wren. She tested it silently, feeling how it fit, how it changed her without erasing who she was. She was still Lila Hart, still stubborn and educated and determined. But now she was also Lila Wren, rancher's wife, partner in a life being built from scratch on Texas soil. Doctor. Pierce allowed them to return to the ranch 4 days later, with strict instructions and enough medical supplies to stock a small hospital. Wade drove them home in the wagon, moving carefully over the rough roads, while Lila sat beside Caleb in the back, monitoring him for any signs of distress. When the ranch came into view, Lila felt something deep and fundamental click into place. This was home now. Not the house her aunt had controlled in Philadelphia, not the borrowed rooms of her teaching position, not a temporary stop on the way to somewhere else. This was her land, her life, her future spread out before her in rolling hills and open sky. The new barn frame stood half-finished against the horizon, testimony to work interrupted and waiting to resume. The house looked small and sturdy, smoke rising from the chimney. Dorothy had promised to keep the fire going and stock the pantry. The garden Lila had been tending showed green and promising in neat rows. "Home," Caleb said softly, echoing her thoughts. "Home," Lila agreed. Recovery was slow and frustrating for a man accustomed to constant activity. Caleb chafed against the restrictions, tried repeatedly to do more than he should, and had to be reminded, sometimes forcefully, that he'd been gored by a bull and needed to heal properly. Lila became expert at distraction, at finding tasks he could do while sitting, at enlisting Wade to keep him occupied with planning rather than physical labor. They spent long afternoons on the porch, Caleb resting while Lila worked, mending, preserving vegetables, planning meals. They talked about everything and nothing, building the kind of deep knowledge of each other that only time and proximity could create. Lila learned that Caleb hated coffee but drank it anyway because it was practical. He learned that she sang quietly to herself when she thought no one was listening, old songs her mother had taught her. They learned to navigate the intimate daily realities of marriage, how to share space, how to read each other's moods, how to argue productively and forgive quickly. It wasn't always easy. Caleb's natural reticence sometimes frustrated Lila, who wanted more communication, more sharing. Lila's efficiency sometimes made Caleb feel useless, dependent, when he was accustomed to being self-sufficient. But they worked through it, day by day, conversation by conversation, until understanding became instinctive. 6 weeks after the injury, Dr. Pierce pronounced Caleb fully healed, scarred but sound, capable of returning to full ranch work. The first thing Caleb did was ride out to check the herd properly, Lila beside him on a borrowed mare, her riding skills now proficient enough that she rarely needed guidance. They sat on the rise behind the house, watching the cattle graze in the valley below, and Caleb turned to her with an expression of contentment she'd never seen before. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For staying, for fighting, for becoming the partner I didn't know how to ask for." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. "For loving me even when I'm difficult." "You're not difficult." Lila squeezed his hand. "You're real, and that's all I ever wanted." That fall, they broke ground on the new house. It would take 2 years to complete. Built slowly as money and time allowed, but they planned it together. Every room, every window, every detail chosen jointly. The old house would become storage, a guest space, a reminder of where they'd started. The new barn was completed by October, larger and better designed than the original. They held a barn-raising party that drew people from 3 counties, and Lila cooked for 40 people, laughing as Dorothy and the other ranch wives taught her the tricks of feeding crowds. Winter came hard that year, testing everything Caleb had warned her about. The isolation, the cold, the relentless work of keeping animals alive through storms. But Lila discovered she was stronger than she'd known, more resilient, more capable. She learned to read weather in the sky, to anticipate problems before they became crises, to work beside Caleb as a true partner. And on a frozen January night, she told him she was pregnant. Caleb's face went through a dozen emotions in rapid succession: shock, fear, joy, wonder, before settling into fierce protectiveness. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be." Lila placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "Dr. Pierce confirmed it yesterday when I rode into town." "You rode?" Caleb's eyes widened. "Lila, you can't be riding if you're—" "I'm fine. Women have babies all the time without becoming invalids." But she softened her tone, understanding his fear. "I'll be careful. I promise." He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her carefully, as if she might break. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our baby." "Our baby," Lila confirmed. "Due sometime in August." They stood together in the kitchen of the house that would soon be too small, holding each other against the winter cold, planning for a future that felt impossibly bright. The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure. Their daughter arrived in late summer of 1876, small and fierce and absolutely perfect. They named her Margaret Rose. Margaret for the aunt Lila had finally forgiven through letters of reconciliation, Rose for beauty that grew in unexpected places. More children followed, a son 2 years later, another daughter 3 years after that. The new house was completed when Margaret was 4, and the whole family moved in together, christening each room with laughter and the chaotic noise of childhood. Lila started teaching again, this time from home, working with the ranch children from neighboring properties who had no school nearby. She set up a small classroom in one room of the new house and taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and science to a rotating group of students whose parents were grateful for someone willing to educate girls and boys equally. The ranch prospered. Caleb and Wade expanded the operation, buying additional land, improving the herd. Lila proved to have a head for business, managing the books and finances with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything else. And through it all, through seasons of plenty and seasons of hardship, through the ordinary and the extraordinary, Caleb and Lila built the partnership they'd both been seeking. Not perfect, but real. Not easy, but honest. Not the fairy tale she'd stopped believing in, but something better. A life earned through work and trust and the daily choice to keep choosing each other. On a warm evening in spring of 1885, 10 years after Lila had stepped off that stagecoach into a Texas storm, she sat on the porch of their completed house with Caleb beside her. Their children played in the yard, Margaret teaching her younger siblings to identify wildflowers, their voices carrying on the breeze. "Do you ever regret it?" Caleb asked, the question surprising after so many years. "Giving up your old life for this one?" Lila looked at him, at the man she'd known for 10 years now, who still surprised her sometimes with his moments of vulnerability. She looked at their children, at the land stretching toward the horizon, at the life they'd built from letters and faith and stubborn determination. "Not even once," she said honestly. "This is everything I didn't know I was looking for." Caleb's hand found hers, their fingers linking with the ease of long practice. "Me too." They sat together as the sun set, painting the Texas sky in shades of amber and rose, watching their children play, and Lila thought about the girl who'd stood alone in the rain, terrified and hopeful, wondering if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. That girl had been brave, braver than she'd known, brave enough to leave everything familiar for something real, brave enough to claim a life on her own terms instead of accepting one handed down by others, brave enough to love a stranger and trust that love could grow into something lasting. And it had. Against odds and expectations, despite fire and injury and all the small and large challenges that life brought, it had grown into something beautiful and durable and true. Lila squeezed Caleb's hand, and he squeezed back, and they sat together watching the sunset over the land they'd built a life on, knowing without words that this, all of this, was exactly where they were meant to be. The ranch continued to thrive. The children grew strong and capable. The town of Willow Creek accepted Lila completely, until no one remembered a time when she hadn't been part of the community. Dorothy became like a mother to her, and Wade like a brother. The seasons turned, the cattle grazed, the land endured. And through it all, every morning when Lila woke beside Caleb in the house they'd designed together, she remembered that storm, that crossroads, that moment when she'd had to choose between the known and the possible. She'd chosen possibility, chosen courage, chosen love. And it had chosen her right back, every single day since. Some stories end with happily ever after, as if happiness were a destination reached and then maintained without effort. But Lila and Caleb's story was different. Their happiness wasn't an ending, but a practice, a commitment renewed daily through work and honesty, and the simple act of showing up for each other, even when it was hard. They built a life, they raised a family, though they turned a lonely ranch into a home full of laughter and purpose. They proved that partnership wasn't about perfection, but about persistence. Not about being saved, but about choosing to save yourself and then choosing someone to walk beside. And on quiet evenings when the work was done and the children were sleeping, when Caleb would find Lila on the porch and sit beside her without words, their hands linking automatically in the gathering dark. In those moments, Lila would think about that stagecoach, that storm, that leap of faith into the unknown, best decision she'd ever made. Every single time she thought about it, the answer was the same: best decision she'd ever made.